And here we are, the last Friday of the month, and we have the Planetarians web seminar. And this week we are pleased to have Julia Plummer to speak with us about the research. This is something we haven't done before, research in planetarium education, and she is world-renowned expert in that area. So I'll turn it over to you now, Julia.
Great, thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me. I thought this was I think this is a wonderful platform for the planetarium community to have these seminars, and I think it's exciting to get to talk about doing planetarium research. So I'm going to share my slides, and let's see if this shares. Okay, do you see my title slide?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so in a minute I'm going to get started with my presentation. A couple of things. If you want to ask questions during the presentation, please feel free to ask. Trying to see. Okay, now right now I am not seeing where the chat is, and so you can either call out. Yeah, you might have to, because oh wait, hold on. No?
Julia, let me interject here.
Sure.
I forgot to say, everybody, it's good practice to keep yourself on mute unless you want to say something, and then you have to remember to unmute. But the chat button should be at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, I found it got hidden because I suddenly had a whole bunch of other things that I can now do because I'm sharing my screen, so it's given me a bunch more buttons. But for everyone else, it should be at the bottom of your screen. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, so please, jump in if you have a question during my presentation. I'm going to ask you some questions during my presentation to hopefully get a little bit of discussion and feedback, so that it's not just a half an hour of me talking. Partly because this is a really tricky topic, getting started with educational research in the planetarium. There's a lot to know to get started. So I think that if you have some specific questions, I'm really excited to know what everyone's actually curious about and would like to talk about that. So either you can ask some specific things as I'm going along, but also really think as I'm going along what you want to know more about for the bigger discussion we'll have at the end. Yeah, so Alan said, yeah, I've been doing research in planetariums for a while. My dissertation looked at children learning in the planetarium. I looked at first and second graders learning about the apparent motion of the sun, moon, and stars. I've done other studies that kind of build on that with the planetarium and connecting that to the classroom. And I've also looked at kind of some of the ideas that educators bring to the class, to the planetarium. So, this has been a big part of the research that I've been doing, but I also do a lot of research outside of the planetarium, in museums with young children, in classrooms with middle school students. So I have a broad range of research areas, but pretty much all it deals with astronomy. Okay, so now let's see if I can go to my first slide on the outline. I'm going to talk about research questions. To me, research questions are essential. I'm going to go into that a bit. And we'll look at how and why to use the research literature. And I think that can be intimidating for people when you get started. Is like, there is so much literature out there, but it's really vital if you're going to engage with educational research. And then how do you move into actually designing your study? What do you need to think about? Analyzing your data, publishing your results. If you're going to be doing research, you want to get it out there to the community. And then I put this plug in at the end again. What questions do you have about research? So you're thinking about that as we go along. Okay, so your research probably is going to start with what you want to know. So research starts with your own interests. like something you're curious about. Maybe it's with your planetarium, maybe it's with your audience, maybe it's with the community you serve, or with the planetarium field at large, but it's something you personally should be curious about, because research is hard. So if you're going to do it and be sustained with it, it's got to be something you're interested in. But then you have to ask yourself, will anyone else care about this? And if the answer is no, it's probably not really going to be research. So there's research and there's evaluation. If we're just trying to understand the effectiveness of a program that we've developed with an audience, maybe that's evaluation, and that's really valuable because it helps us improve the quality of the programs we're delivering to an audience. But if the outcomes aren't really going to be applicable to anyone else, then that's not research. Research is about developing new ideas that other people can take and use to build their own practice. And so then once you figured that out, like, am I really doing something that's going to contribute to the bigger field? You can say, well, okay, how do I craft this curiosity I have, this kind of vague idea, into a question, but also ask, is this something that I can justify asking with the research literature? Like, is this something that, you know, is worth asking? I'm going to delve into that a little more in the presentation. So I took a little time to look at some of the topics that people have studied in planetarium research. And this is by no means exhaustive. I just kind of pulled a bunch of the articles that I've read about planetarium research. I've looked at, that's both in the Planetarian, the IPS journal. The Planetarian has lots of good articles that are research articles written by people in our community for people interested in research in the planetarium. But there's also lots of other journals that have published articles on planetarium related research. And I looked at the general types of topics that are being covered. And it's things like the relationship between show design and what visitors are learning. So you design a show, how did that impact learning? Or how did that impact interest, what people are interested in? Which program designs impacts learning or interest more? So comparative studies. Studies about who visits the planetarium, why do they visit the planetarium? Studies about, what ways do planetarium educators engage audiences? And this is one that there's only, some of these are just very little research, and the others there's a lot. And how does professional development support planetarium educators? So that's an area I think we need more of. This seminar series is an example of professional development. Well, you could ask a question about, how does this seminar series help the people in the planetarium community learn more? In what ways did the audience's ideas or interests change? So not just did the audience learn, but in what ways did they learn? What was the quality of that change? They became more interested in astronomy, but more interested in what ways? Are they going to go out and go to a star party? Are they going to come back to the planetarium? So some more of those specific features. You could ask research questions about the factors that influence what people learn. So one of the areas that I study is how spatial skills influence what we learn. We're in astronomy, so we understand that there are a lot of spatial topics in astronomy. If you think about phases of the moon, why phases of the moon? Well, that's being able to visualize how the moon is orbiting the Earth, but it's also illuminated by the sun. And so what's that relationship? That's really complicated spatial perspective taking. And there are people who are better at spatial perspective taking, and that might influence what they would learn if they came to a planetarium show about the phases of the moon. And then other topics could be around, how does a planetarium visit support classroom learning? So again, this is not an exhaustive coverage of what you might study with research. And I think that's what's really exciting is when people start really thinking creatively about what you might be interested in and where that might go. But this is sort of the range of what educational research might focus on as we move ahead with the presentation. Okay, so you've got an interest, you're thinking about a question, you're like, yeah, this is what I want to study. But you really need to engage with the research literature. And so this is the sort of my first point where I'm going to stop and try to get a little bit of audience participation here and ask my audience here, why do we use research literature when crafting a research question? Like, why is it important to go to the research literature as we're thinking about what our research question is? What are your ideas?
To see if it's something that's already been looked into?
Yeah.
Not reinventing the wheel?
Yeah. Is this going to be a unique contribution, or has somebody already done this? Great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and if somebody has already done something, to build on it, either to add more data to the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
or to answer another question that is related.
Yeah.
I was say maybe that would stimulate ideas that you might have, like, oh yeah, but how about this? Or, so seeing the research already.
Exactly.
Really inspiring you. Yeah.
Extending the field, like, oh, here's what's known. I can take it further with my study.
And I think the times make a difference. Kids have access to technology that's as fancy as a planetarium. So research from the 70s is going to have a different context from current research.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that you can even take the same study and go, I hypothesize I'm going to find something different because kids are different, technology is different. Yeah, that's a great idea. I love that. Great. Okay, so any other ideas? Okay, so here's my list. Demonstrate a unique contribution, showing how you're going to expand on the literature. We hit that. Maybe you're identifying gaps in the literature, questions. If you're kind of struggling, like you have an idea, but you're not sure how to frame it, if you read the literature, it might help you, because often when a researcher writes a paper, they'll pose questions of what to do, and you're like, yeah, that's it. That's exactly what I want to do, and it might help you frame your study. New contexts or populations, I think that's sort of John's point. It's like, okay, this study's been done, but that was, 30, 40, 50 years ago. I technically have, I have a new population because kids are different now. The other reasons why you might go to the literature is that, especially in educational research, it can be really difficult because there's challenges with drift on what we mean by words. And so if you can read the literature and say, okay, this is how people are talking about these ideas, the definitions they're using, the frameworks they're using, it helps you use the same kind of definitions and frameworks so that you're fitting in the same kind of body of literature as other people publishing on the same topics as you. It might also help you generate a hypothesis. So you're like, you have this kind of gut idea. You're seeing something in your planetarium and you think this intervention is really helping students learn. And you go to the literature to find more empirical basis for your hypothesis to help justify your study. And that might also help you further develop the learning environment that you're trying to design to study, if that's kind of the type of study that you're designing. And I'll give you an example of that in an example I'm going to give later. So the other question is, okay, so now you've said, I need more research literature to help me with my question. Where do you go to get that? And my first recommendation is to not limit yourself just to planetarium studies. Like, there are a lot of good planetarium studies, and it's actually getting much better than when I started 12, 13 years ago or so. There's a lot more research in the planetarium. But there's a lot of research out of the planetarium that can really contribute to your research, giving you ideas. Because, you look at, okay, I'm really interested in spatial thinking. Well, there's a lot of research on spatial thinking but not a lot of that's in the planetarium. So you learn about that in these other contexts and then think, well, how would that apply to the planetarium? So taking these other studies in other environments, contexts, and populations and applying it to your context. Go to Google Scholars. Try your search terms. I know that one of the struggles with, if you're not at a university, it may be hard to get access to a lot of journal articles to download. Go ahead and email the authors. Most authors will be happy to send you a PDF of their study. You know, like I would be happy to if anybody wants a copy of my paper. Sure, here you go. I'm happy to share it. Like, you know, we want people to read our research. And then finally, I just want to really point out, if you haven't seen the research syntheses from the National Research Council, these are really great places to start if you're just getting started reading the research literature. They've taken, you know, big chunks of the research literature, written syntheses. You can still go back to the original empirical articles because they have all the citations on a lot of areas in science education. So they're really valuable. They're all free. Download these books and get started to understand, you know, big topics like English language learners and STEM education, informal science, literacy, disciplinary-based science learning. So a really valuable resource. Okay. So I wanted to talk through a quick example of why it's important to use the literature in a study. And I think this builds on some of the ideas that we've been talking about. So on the left, research question A is a question that's really kind of a question you might ask that's maybe more evaluation. You're just asking, do students know more about seasonal constellations after this great show I've created called Seasonal Stars, right? I just want to know, did they learn more? And then on the right-hand side, research question B is the question that my colleagues and I have been working on with a study we've been doing. Do students learn more about seasonal constellations from an embodied planetarium show than one that uses traditional methods? And I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a second. So the challenge with research question A is if you try to publish this and you didn't start with research literature, you have to realize, okay, there's no real hypothesis behind why you'd expect students to learn from this show, which would limit how much you could actually learn from the findings. So if you found that students learned from this particular planetarium show, what more can you say about why they learned? It's like, well, what caused them to learn? What's the underlying theoretical basis for learning in that show if you didn't base it on the empirical literature or a theoretical framework? In the study that I'm doing with my colleagues, we were curious about how our movements, how the way that our body interacts with our environment could be used to help us learn in the planetarium. So my past research had looked at how we can get children to use their gestures to learn the motion of the sun, moon, and stars. And so for this one, we kind of took it further to really design a show that said, okay, the whole show is about learning why we see seasonal constellations. Not only are they going to learn about the constellations, their motions with their arms, we're going to have them stand up and act out the motions of the Earth during the planetarium show. And we'll compare that to another show that they don't actually move around, but they still learn seasonal constellation concepts. And we based this on the literature that describes learning through embodiment. And so that gave us a hypothesis for why we think students might learn in this show. We also use the literature on what students' ideas are about seasonal constellations and other related concepts, and use that to help us design the show. And that allows us to have basically an empirically justified and theoretically justified hypothesis for what we expect to find in the planetarium program. And that way we can build on that as we try to make a contribution to the literature. So there's a couple of different types of research questions that people publish. the main ones that I see in our field are descriptive and causal. Descriptive, and these are just a couple from some planetarium studies that I've seen recently. Descriptive are those that are descriptive. They describe something that you're seeing in the planetarium environment. So the first one is like, what aspects of the educational intervention in the allocentric digital full dome planetarium did the participants appreciate the most? So you're kind of just describing what the participants appreciated. Or what are teachers' goals for their students during their visit to the planetarium? And those are things that, okay, now other people could use that information to build other studies, to help them plan a planetarium show, etc. Causal questions are relational questions. So is there a difference in student understanding of introductory astronomy when taught in an immersive or a non-immersive of the same visualization? So doing a comparative study. Or do students who participate in a planetarium program that uses kinesthetic learning techniques improve in their descriptions? So that's like a longitudinal from pre to post, a comparison study. There's also mechanistic research questions, and those are ones where you're trying to understand the mechanism for why learning changes. And I see less of those studies because they really require a lot of in-depth, focused work on how and why the change is occurring. All right, so research methods. Your question guides the design of the study. And this is why I hammer on research questions so much. With my graduate students, with my undergraduates, like you have to have a research question. And if I see a paper that doesn't have a research question, I'm like, well, how do I know if you have the right research methods if I don't know what you're trying to ask? Like your research question really needs to be guiding the design of your entire study. It doesn't mean that you can't change your research question as you're revising your methods, you revise your question. It can be an iterative process. But that question is really important to really help you think through, is what I'm doing, is that what I'm trying to design going to help me answer the question that I'm interested in? So I thought that I'd kind of walk through the question that my research group, or ask you guys actually to help me walk through the research question my research group is working with right now, and ask, how does this question inform the design of our study? Like, what are the implications of our research question to what we need to do in our study to answer the question? So I'm opening this up to the group again. What do you guys think?
It sounds like you're going to be doing at least two different types of shows. One using the embodied cognitive theory, and one more tradition, just oral.
Yeah, exactly. So we had to design two different shows. We were trying to be very careful that they both covered the same concepts, but one was designed using our embodied theory. The other was designed to use more, verbal engagement, but not physical engagement, right? So what else does this imply about how we're going to need to collect data? Anything else you see?
I see a possible problem actually with the
Sure.
or a challenge on it. You could compare if you're using the exact same visuals in each show, or the exact same this and that, just to get a quote controlled kind of study going. In my experience with my limited experience, that's very difficult to do in a fair way, and so because adding the embodied element to the show inherently makes it, well, it has to make it different. That's the whole point. But is there some other factor that is making one show much worse than the other? That would skew the results tremendously.
Well, that's a really good point that, as a researcher, you have to be careful about, is how are you not biasing your results? If you're trying to do a comparison, is it a fair comparison? One thing that you want to do at the very least is when you present your results or publish your results, have very clear descriptions of both conditions so that the audience can, the readers can judge for themselves and say, okay, you found these results, but I understand the context. Maybe it's because of what was in this show and what was lacking in this show. In this case, there were very different visuals in each of the shows. They basically both started with the same Earth-based perspective, like looking up into the sky and seeing the constellations at different times. And then they had very different experiences after that. One group did, if you're familiar with kinesthetic sky time, they essentially did that, walking around with constellations on the walls and seeing what you would see from, as you rotate in place to be day and night, and then orbit halfway around, and what would you see if you were in a different place on Earth. And then the traditional group actually got to see a starry night visualization of how things move in the solar system. And so, but the other group didn't see that visualization. So they got very different ways of learning the explanation. And I'll talk about what we found in a little bit. So go ahead.
The way that you quiz the students to see what they learned is going to be very important here.
Yeah.
What kind of questions you ask them so that it's not sort of leading, and so you'd have to really be careful in how you put your questions together, or whatever you use to quiz to evaluate what they did learn.
So we have to have something in our design to have a measurement of learning. So and really think carefully that they're not leading questions, that they're going to be a fair evaluation of what they know about seasonal constellations and why we see different constellations over the course of the year. So what I put down, and there's many things we need to think about with the design, so I put just a few of the things, and it's 2 conditions. Our subjects are students, right? So we decided for this study to use undergraduate students because they were a population we were able to get access to and get them to come to the planetarium in a reasonable amount of time. And then we needed a way to measure what they've learned. And so we decided to do that, a measurement before and a measurement immediately after. And there's problems with doing an immediate after, but I think with the planetarium, it's very hard to do a delayed test of students' understanding. So the next thing I'm going to talk through is like some of these other features that we've been talking through that we had to think about. Why did we choose 2 conditions? Well, if we'd just done one, like, oh, do students learn in an embodied planetarium show? We could do that. And I've done studies like that when, like, well, I don't even know if students are going to learn coming to this program at all. But we really wanted to know more about, like, well, is this mode actually a better way of learning? Is there something better about engaging physically than not engaging physically? And so we wanted to do a comparison to start trying to tease that apart. As I said, we used college students because they're a population that we were able to get into the planetarium. I think I think there's some limitations with this that I would have rather had some students who we had a few too many students who started with too much prior knowledge. And I think that was a limitation because they came in with knowing, maybe not full explanation for seasonal constellations, though some did. And so that was a limitation. You want to start with a population who still needs to learn the concepts. Why did we choose to interview? So we interviewed these students, and that's something that you kind of have to wrestle with. How are you going to collect the data? Do you give them survey? Do you give them multiple choice test? We were concerned that this conceptual area was so complex that we wanted to give them open-ended interview questions that they could talk through their answers, and if we needed to, we could probe them more, give them prompts to tell us more. We also thought that because we were doing this embodied program, that we might see differences in how students explained it if they learned in a physical way, that they might explain it in an interview differently because they learned it in a different way. So we chose to interview the students. And then we had to think, okay, how many students are we going to interview? And that's tricky. There's not one right answer to how many students you need. I try to have at least 20 in a sample. And if you're going to do any statistical comparison, you really want to start getting larger numbers, but it's hard to get enough students that you can actually interview. So we were limited by interviewing, and we ended up having 24 students in our embodied condition and 19 in the traditional, just in terms of how many we were able to collect for this study. Okay, so I was going to talk pretty quickly through some of the strengths and weaknesses in collecting data. So multiple choice questions. That's a very common strategy, strengths of multiple choice questions. You can collect a lot of data, right? So you could give a multiple choice assessment to a lot of students. It can be pretty easy. Like, I think, it's one of the advantages if you have a system in your planetarium with clickers, you could put up, multiple choice questions. Audience could just click on what their response is, and you could potentially collect data that way. Weaknesses of multiple choice questions is you basically have to have a good idea of what the possible answers are. So with the seasonal constellation study, we had a general idea of what students' answers might be, but to boil it down into just multiple choice questions might have limited what we could learn about their understanding versus giving them the chance to really give an open-ended explanation. So there's trade-offs on what you're actually measuring if you give multiple choice questions. But there's trade-offs with all of the methods. With interviews, the strength is you can get a lot more detail. You can ask follow-ups. You can probe for understanding. Or if you're asking, adult, why are they coming to the planetarium? If they give you, one sentence answer, you can ask them to tell you more. But weaknesses, it takes time. And then you have lots of information that you have to figure out what you're going to do with. And you have similar issues with video of audiences or open-ended surveys. And so you just have to decide what's going to be best for answering your research question. And at that point, you have to figure out, okay, now that you have your data, how are you going to analyze it? And here's where it really depends on what kind of data you've collected. And so I'm just going to walk through pretty quickly how we're analyzing the data from our study, because all of this is so specific to the study you're doing and the data you have, that I just wanted to give one example for this presentation. So our research question, we collected pre and post interviews with students for both the embodied and the traditional planetarium show. We then had to think about, okay, so we have all of this really rich data on how students explained why we have seasonal constellations. And so how are we going to organize that? So we created a seasonal constellation coding document where we said, okay, one code is going to be accurate, and accurate is going to mean this, and we defined that. And partially accurate is going to mean this, and not accurate or non-normative is going to mean this. And then we have to apply that to our interviews. But to be really rigorous on this, we had 2 different researchers take those same definitions and separately take 10 of the interviews and apply them. And we wanted them to get at least 80 or 90% agreement to say, okay, our definitions are being used the same on the same interviews. We have some reliability. The way that multiple people could look at these interviews and get the same accurate, partially accurate, or non-normative. And after that, the researchers could go code all the rest of the interviews. And now we have those all coded, what do? Well, then we decided to take them and assign them numerical values. So accurate's 3, partially accurate's 2, non-normative is 1, and we could run statistical analyses on these. And so we use non-parametric statistics because it's the nature of this data is kind of ranked ordinal. So first we said, well, did they learn? Did they learn in these shows? Like, that's important. And we found that yes, the students who went to the Embodied Planetarium show learned more, they knew more about seasonal constellations after the program. And the kids who went to the traditional show knew more about seasonal constellations after the program. But then we had to say, well, did the students who went to the Embodied Planetarium show start out at the same level before the show as the students who went to the traditional show? Did they start at the same level playing field? So we compared their pre-interview results, and we found out, yes, they're the same. They were randomly kind of assigned to planetarium shows. But they did. They were the same level. That allowed us to compare their post-instruction results to see, did one group learn more than the other? And what we found was that there was no evidence that one group learned more. So our evidence doesn't show that the Embodied Planetarium supports more learning than what we called the traditional. But it doesn't do worse. Like, they both produced significant improvement in students' understanding of seasonal constellations. So now we have an interesting result. And now what do? Well, we go back to the research literature and we say, how do we explain our result? We have to, we know about the embodied cognition literature, and I think we need to look more at how powerful visualizations could be. And we could propose future studies and say, well, what would have happened if we'd been able to combine the embodiment and the visualization that the traditional show got? Would they have gone even farther? Would they have made even more improvement? And that could give us some more implications. So we already have a new study in mind that could tell us more about how to better support learning. And that leads us to, where we would end up. Our next steps is to try to publish this so that other people can learn about this. And we're really fortunate to have the Planetarian that allows us to kind of publish studies that are of interest to the planetarium community. I just put a few recent interesting studies that have been published in the Planetarian. So if you're not up on your reading of the Planetarian, go back and look at the last couple of years, and there's been some good studies published. And finally, this is really important. I couldn't decide where in this whole thing to stick this, but if you're going to do research and you want to actually publish it, it's really important that you have approval from a human subject research approval from an institutional review board. So IRB, or institutional review boards, review people's research studies to say whether or not they need to have consent from the participants to be part of a research study, and often they do. But it's really important to understand that if you're going to have any human participants in your research study, that it's the IRB that makes the decision as to whether your participants need to be giving consent or not. You don't get to make that decision. And so where do you find an IRB? Universities and colleges have them, some school districts, some, I think, other education and evaluation organizations have access to IRBs. So it's just an important part of the research project to make sure we're all doing our work ethically and above board. And I can talk to people more about that if you're interested. And with that, I will thank you for participating. And I have a few other resources here. I wrote an article with Shannon Small, Kington Chu, and Krista Gent, a guide to conducting educational research in the planetarium that came out in 2015, and a couple other resources. So thank you.
Oh, Julia, that was wonderful. This has got to be one of the best presentations we've had. Of course, I bet you say that to all the presenters. But it's true. This is like one of the first ones to have built into it and a real participation from the participants or the attendees. So that's great. You know what? I'm going to stop the recording momentarily and start a new one for the question and answer period.